At 0900 on July 4, 1943, Private First Class Evan Evans pressed himself low behind a wall of sandbags on the soaked edge of Renova Island, watching 16 Japanese Betty bombers glide into view through the torn layers of cloud drifting above Blanche Channel, and he felt the same tight pressure in his stomach that had followed him since he had arrived on this miserable strip of land 3 weeks earlier, a 22-year-old Marine who had yet to bring down a single aircraft while the enemy kept coming day after day, as if this island existed only to test how much fire a man could face before breaking. The bombers were heading straight toward the stretch of beach the Marines had bitterly named Suicide Point because 2 days earlier 59 Americans had died on this very sand when the Japanese launched a huge raid from Rabaul, sending 18 bombers supported by more than 400 fighters, and Renova's radar sets had been smashed by an earlier attack, leaving the defenders with no warning and no chance to prepare. Evans had witnessed the disaster firsthand from his gun position at 1400 hours, as the Betty skimmed just above the water, then tore into the fuel depots, the ammunition stacks, and even the field hospital where wounded Marines waited to be evacuated. Flames consumed everything. Explosions hurled debris 300 feet into the air. Men tried to run into the inferno to pull the injured out, but most never returned. 77 more were wounded. 4 of those were from the 9th Defense Battalion's 90mm gun crews. The battalion also lost 2 of its 6 155mm Long Tom artillery pieces. Trucks melted under the heat. Ammunition ignited without being touched and blasted apart for 6 straight hours. Suicide Point lived up to its name. Every ship approaching the beach saw the black smoke rise. Every Marine stationed there felt the dread settle in their chest. Evans and his crew had fired 32 shells, in that attack all of them missing because the bombers moved too quickly and the radar operators were working blind. Gun directors were forced to judge distance and timing using only stopwatches and binoculars. By the time a shell reached altitude, the enemy had already streaked past. That night, Lieutenant Colonel William Scheer gathered the surviving 90mm crews and spoke with no wasted breath. The radar systems were destroyed, he said, and the replacement components were days away from reaching the island. The enemy would return. They always returned, and the next time there might not be enough men left alive to bury the dead. Evans cleaned his weapon until 0300. The 90mm M1 anti-aircraft gun weighed 9 tons and could throw a 24-pound shell to 33,000 feet with a maximum fire rate of 28 rounds per minute. But none of that meant anything without radar because the Japanese Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber could fly at more than 270 miles per hour, and at that speed it crossed 2 miles in 27 seconds, making it nearly impossible for human eyes or mechanical calculators to track without electronic guidance. The 9th Defense Battalion had landed on Renova on June 30th, with a straightforward assignment to defend the beachhead, while Army artillery pounded Japanese installations on New Georgia across the channel. The battalion possessed 3 batteries of 90mm guns with 4 guns per battery, 12 in total, meant to create a wall of flak impenetrable to enemy aircraft, yet instead they had become targets. If you want to see how Evans and his crew turned Suicide Point into a graveyard for Japanese bombers, please hit that like button, because it helps us share more stories about the Marines who fought in the Pacific. Subscribe if you have not already. By the morning of July 3rd, rain hammered Renova without stopping, turning foxholes into pits of mud and leaving Marines standing watch up to their knees in water. Supplies rotted openly on the beach, but the storm brought one small mercy since the Japanese rarely flew in heavy weather. The 9th Defense Battalion used every minute to repair damaged equipment. Salvage teams scavenged parts from wrecked gear while mechanics worked throughout the night. And at dawn on July 4th, something changed. The radar operators reported that their SCR-268 units were functional again, not flawless, but working. Gun directors tested their systems. Fire control teams confirmed that communication lines connected all 12 gun positions. Evans filled the ready racks. His crew rehearsed their drill loader, rammer, fuse setter gunner, the same motions they had performed thousands of times, but training could not prepare anyone for the moment when Bettys dropped bombs on your friends. At 0845, the radar picked up a heavy formation coming from Rabaul 120 miles away, bearing 320 and flying at 14,000 feet directly down the slot toward Renova. Scheer gave the order for every gun crew to stand ready. This time they had radar. This time they would see the enemy long before the bombs fell. And this time Evan Evans was about to show how a single Marine behind a 90mm gun could rewrite the mathematics of air defense if he lived long enough to fire. The radar operators updated the plot every 30 seconds as the formation split, with one group turning toward New Georgia, while the other kept coming straight at Renault, 16 bombers, shielded by 180 fighters, descending through 12,000 feet, heading straight into the range of Evans' gun. The combat air patrol that normally shielded Renova had been pulled far to the north to intercept another incoming raid, which meant that when the Japanese formation closed in, the Marines on the island stood alone with nothing but their guns and their nerve. Evans kept his eyes locked on the gun director, the complex Sperry M4 mechanical computer that received the raw stream of radar numbers and tried to turn them into firing solutions. In theory, the director sent electrical impulses to the gun mount, which would then shift smoothly to the correct elevation and azimuth. But in reality, the M4 had been designed for optical tracking rather than radar data, so the system struggled to match the speed of moving aircraft. Even the most experienced crews could usually get their shells no closer than 200 meters from a target. A 90mm round had a lethal burst radius of roughly 50 meters, which meant a single gun rarely killed anything by itself. Massed fire was the key, but here at Suicide Point, Evans did not have the luxury of massed fire. He had his own weapon battery Seagun 3 and a sky full of bombers. At 70 miles out, the radar showed the Japanese in a tight V formation, a classic Betty approach pattern. They would descend at medium altitude, release their bombs in one clean line, then turn sharply and let their Zero escorts handle whatever fighters attempted pursuit. But Renova had no fighters in the air. At 0915, the air raid siren wailed across the island. Marines sprinted for cover. Medics clutched their bags. Seabees dropped whatever cargo they were unloading and dove toward the nearest protection. In seconds, the bustling beach became an empty stretch of sand, except for the gun crews who stayed rooted to their positions, readying themselves to meet the coming storm. Evans checked his ammunition one more time, the high explosive shells fitted with variable time fuses that could be adjusted in half-second increments. At 10,000 feet, a shell would travel for roughly 18 seconds before detonation. If the fuse timing was off by even 1 second, the burst would occur too high or too low, leaving the target untouched. The bombers were 50 miles out, now maintaining 10,000 feet high enough to avoid most light anti-aircraft fire, but well within reach of the heavy 90mm guns. The Japanese crews had seen American flak 2 days earlier, but they were not worried. For 18 months, they had flown through inaccurate bursts across the Pacific and dismissed them as nothing more than noisy distractions. That confidence was about to break apart. At 30 miles, Colonel Scheer gave the command to open fire. All 12 guns roared at once. The sound was earth-shaking. Each 90mm cannon spat a round every 3 seconds, sending 24-pound shells climbing into the sky at nearly 3,000 feet per second. The blasts knocked dust from sandbags and rattled the ground beneath the Marines' boots. Evans fell into rhythm without thinking, letting the repetition carry him. The loader pulled a shell from the ready rack, the rammer shoved it into the breech, the fuse setter spun the dial to the exact time. The breech slammed shut. The recoil hammered the carriage as the gun fired. The empty casing popped free. Then again, load, ram, set fire. The radar operators tracked the formation with far greater accuracy than they had possessed 2 days earlier. The repaired SCR-268 fed updates into the M4 calculators faster than the machines could comfortably handle. Levers clicked, gears spun, readouts shifted constantly as the bombers approached. At 20 miles, the first shells burst in the sky, leaving black clouds ahead of the formation, slightly off course. The Japanese adjusted their heading by a fraction and kept coming. Evans watched through his sight as his own shells detonated 500 meters from the lead bomber, close but still too far. The Betty had a wingspan of 82 feet, so a near miss did nothing. Only precision bursts could bring one down. 15 miles. 88 American shells were already in the air. Then something changed, something small and almost invisible, but significant enough to turn an ordinary gun crew into a deadly force. Battery C's gun director locked cleanly onto the return from the lead bomber. No interference, no distortion, no ghosting. The M4 began solving angles and timing with sudden clarity. The gun shifted 2 degrees up and 3 degrees left, settling into a perfect intercept position. Evans squeezed the trigger. The shell streaked skyward, climbing through 8,000 feet of tropical air. The fuse counted down in silent intervals. 18 seconds later, the round exploded 200 meters ahead of the lead Betty. The bomber flew straight into the blast. Shrapnel ripped through its right engine. Flames erupted instantly, trailing a thick stream of smoke. The pilot fought to keep formation because Japanese doctrine demanded discipline above survival, but the fire worsened until the aircraft began drifting out of its position. In 30 seconds, the wing was engulfed from root to tip. Unable to continue, the pilot turned away, hoping to limp back toward Japanese-held territory. He never got the chance. At 6,000 feet, the burning wing tore free, sending the bomber spinning toward the sea, where it shattered on impact 4 miles northwest of Renova. 1 down, 15 remaining. The bombers tightened formation. At 7 miles, Evans could see their silhouettes as dark shapes across the morning sky, their bomb bay doors gaping open as they prepared their run. Renova's guns unleashed fresh bursts. Flak swallowed the formation. When the haze cleared, 2 more Bettys were trailing smoke, one missing half its tail and spinning down, the other losing engine power from both sides. Neither made it far, 3 kills. The Japanese dropped their bombs prematurely 6 miles out, erupting the water with towering columns, but none touched the island. They turned sharply, trying to escape. Evans kept firing, his body moving without pause. The bombers were retreating, but still within range. Battery C tracked another bomber centrally positioned in the broken formation. Evans corrected elevation and fired. The shell detonated 50 meters below the belly, and the shockwave punched the aircraft downward into a dive it could not recover from. 4 gone. The formation disintegrated. Pilots scattered in every direction, some west toward New Georgia, others northwest toward Rabaul. The Zero fighters abandoned them entirely. But the Marines were not finished. And in the next short minute, Battery C would help destroy 8 more bombers, shaping July 4, 1943, into the deadliest day Japanese naval aviation had ever suffered in the Solomons-provided Evan Evans gun. Beryl survived the inferno of continuous fire since the metal now glowed, red with heat waves rising from it, like mirages in the sun. The Japanese bombers were closing fast now, no more than a few minutes from reaching the coastline, and every Marine on Renova understood that whatever happened in the next moments would determine whether the island lived through another day or burned like it had 2 days earlier. Evans continued firing without pause, feeling the heat pouring from the gun barrel, rising in waves that shimmered in the air as the metal pushed toward dangerous temperatures. If it warped the rifling, the shells would begin to drift off course and the gun might become useless, but there was no time to slow down. The bombers were still coming and the clock was running out. Load. Ram. Set. Fire. Repeat until your muscles stopped belonging to you. At 10 miles, something happened that changed the entire trajectory of the battle. Battery C's gun director achieved an even cleaner radar lock, this time not on the lead bomber, but on one of the central aircraft, the return bright and steady, as if the enemy plane were broadcasting its position intentionally. The M4 computer reacted instantly, calculating a firing solution with unusually tight precision. The gun mount shifted its elevation by 2 degrees and nudged slightly left. Evans fired. The shell tore upward through the heavy morning air, reaching its burst point 18 seconds later. This time, the explosion blossomed less than 200 meters ahead of the bomber, and the aircraft met the shrapnel head-on. The blast smashed through the right engine casing and blew fragments into the wing spar. Fire streaked across the paneling, and the engine began howling in a shrill, uneven pitch. The Japanese pilot held formation for as long as he could because breaking cohesion was seen as dishonor, but the flames spread too quickly. The bomber sagged out of position, trailing smoke and fire, as it tried to bank away toward the northwest, perhaps hoping to ditch somewhere that offered at least a chance of survival. The attempt failed. At 6,000 feet, the right wing tore away entirely. The bomber flipped inverted, plunging like a stone into the channel, and shattered on the surface, sending a fountain of water skyward. One more kill. The remaining 15 were still bearing down. Evans lifted his head briefly and saw the silhouettes of the approaching Betties sharp against the morning brightness, their bomb bay doors hanging open, exposing the cargo meant to turn Renova into ash. All across the island, the other 90mm batteries were firing without pause. The flak built into a sky full of smoke bursts that swallowed the Japanese formation. When the haze parted, 2 more Betties were visibly damaged, one with its tail almost completely severed, tumbling into a spin, the other losing altitude in a slow, agonizing descent as both engines sputtered. Neither survived long enough to release accurate ordnance. That brought the total to 3. But Evans still had the sense that the true turning point had only just begun. The Japanese bombardiers in the remaining aircraft realized they could not fly directly over Renova without getting torn apart. So they released their bombs early 6 miles from shore, sending their payloads into open water, creating geysers taller than palm trees. Not a single bomb struck the island. With their run aborted, the Betties banked hard to the west, trying to escape the kill zone. Evans and his crew chased them with fire. He tracked a bomber from the center of the retreating cluster, watching the readings from the gun director shift smoothly as the system updated in real time. He fired another shell. It soared upward and detonated 50 meters beneath the target, close enough to catch the bomber in the concussion wave. The aircraft jolted violently nose down, then entered a dive so steep it could not recover. The ocean swallowed it several miles offshore, leaving only a dark circle of spreading fuel. 4 kills now. Formation discipline collapsed entirely at that moment. Instead of tight lines, the Betties scattered in multiple directions, each pilot flying under sheer instinct. Some turned west toward New Georgia. Others swung northwest, attempting to reach Rabaul. The Zero escorts had already abandoned them and fled back up the slot, leaving the bombers fully exposed in open airspace. But the Marines had no intention of letting them go. The next 60 seconds became one of the most violent periods of anti-aircraft fire Renova had ever seen. Battery C's gun and the crews along the island unleashed everything they had. Evans stayed locked on his target, ignoring the rising heat radiating from the barrel. One bomber attempted to climb toward 9,000 feet, believing altitude would grant safety, but the radar tracked it easily. Evans fired 2 rounds in rapid rhythm, the first bursting high, the second exploding just 30 meters behind the tail and tearing the elevator controls apart. The bomber fell into a sickening flat spin, crashing into the jungle of New Georgia, 3 miles inland. That made 5. 2 more Betties tried to escape low under the radar at 5,000 feet, but the SCR-268 tracked them clearly. Battery C and Battery E fired within seconds of each other, and both scored direct hits, the first bomber losing an engine and rolling, inverted into the channel, the second shearing off its tail before spiraling down. 7 down, smoke filled the sky, now drifting in long curtains of black and gray. Pieces of burning aircraft littered the ocean. Evans pivoted his gun again, tracking another bomber trying to break free toward the open sea. It climbed desperately toward 7,000 feet, racing westward, but it was still well within range. Evans fired 3 rounds in steady rhythm. The third shot ripped through the bomb bay and detonated the payload in a massive explosion that shattered the aircraft mid-air, scattering debris for half a mile across the water. 8 down. All across Renova, the other batteries added their own kills. Battery E claimed 2 more. Battery A downed another. The sky no longer belonged to the Japanese. It belonged to the Marines. Evans focused again on a lone bomber climbing northward toward 11,000 feet. The pilot believing altitude alone would save him, because at that height, most anti-aircraft shells lost precision. But he underestimated the 90mm guns. Evans elevated the weapon, fired, and watched, as the round traveled for 22 seconds, before bursting ahead of the cockpit. The pilot turned instinctively and flew directly into the next timed explosion, which shattered the nose and sent the bomber tumbling into the sea 9 miles north of Renova. 9 kills now. By 09:30, the battle was effectively over. The last 4 surviving bombers raced northwest at full throttle, climbing and fleeing for their lives, while the Zero fighters vanished into the distance. But Battery C was not finished yet, and Evans kept his hands steady, knowing the fight was not over until the final shell left the barrel. The heat pouring from the 90mm M, one gun was reaching a point no crewman ever wanted to witness, but Evans and his team had no intention of stopping because the battle was still unfolding above them in a storm of smoke, fire, and falling wreckage. The gun had already fired more than 40 rounds in barely 7 minutes, and the barrel was glowing so intensely that faint ripples of heat shimmered through the air each time the breach opened. The weapon was built for sustained fire, but not at this impossible tempo, not with every Marine on Renova counting on these few guns to shield the island from another day of death. Evans ignored the burn in his own muscles and stayed locked into the rhythm that had become mechanical. Load, ram, set, fire, again and again, until the world shrank to nothing but metal noise and the rising silhouettes of enemy aircraft. A single Betty bomber broke westward, tearing across the sky toward New Georgia in a last desperate attempt to escape the kill zone. The plane climbed hard, fighting for altitude, 9,000 feet. The pilot believed that gaining height would save him, that the Americans could not reach him if he climbed enough, but the radar had him pinned. Battery C's signal return was sharp. The director turned smoothly, calculating the intercept path. Evans fired twice in quick succession. The first shell streaked past missing high by a thin margin, but the second found its timing, exploding only 30 meters behind the bomber's tail. The shrapnel shredded the Betty's elevator controls. The aircraft lurched violently, then entered a flat spin from which no pilot on Earth could recover. It spiraled downward and vanished beneath the canopy of New Georgia's jungle, crashing 3 miles inland with a muffled roar. 5 down had already become something greater. 2 other Bettys flew northwest together, hugging low altitude at 5,000 feet, trying to slip beneath the radar, but the SCR-268 could track targets far lower than the Japanese realized. Battery C targeted the lead bomber while Battery E focused on the trailing one. Both guns fired almost simultaneously. Both hits found their mark. The first bomber's port engine exploded with such force that the wing twisted and folded, sending the aircraft rolling, inverted before plunging straight down into Blanche Channel. The second bomber lost its entire tail assembly, which separated cleanly, leaving the fuselage to fly forward for barely 8 seconds before dropping nose first into the sea. 7 down. The sky above Renova was becoming a graveyard. Smoking debris drifted through the air, while the ocean below churned with spreading sheets of oil burning on the surface. Yet the Japanese assault continued to unravel across a 10-mile radius. No formation, no discipline, no coordination. Just individual pilots fighting for their own isolated chance at survival. 3 more Bettys turned due west, racing for the open Pacific. They were abandoning the mission, entirely hoping that raw speed alone would carry them home, since the distance to Rabaul was more than 400 miles, and they knew fuel was running low after the heavy approach. Battery C tracked the nearest bomber carefully. Range 8 miles, altitude 7,000 feet, speed 280 miles per hour. Evans could almost feel the frantic desperation of the crew aboard that fleeing aircraft. They were pushing the engines well beyond normal limits, but stress did not matter. Evans fired 3 rounds. The first 2 detonated near but not close enough. The third struck directly beneath the bomb bay. Inside the bomber, the remaining 500-pound explosives had not been fully released. The shell's blast ignited the ordnance within. The entire aircraft blew apart mid-air in a thunderous burst that hurled twisted metal across half a mile of ocean. 8 down, other batteries along Renova were finding their own marks. Battery E shot down 2 more Bettys. Battery A struck another that fell burning into the channel. Thick black smoke rose from the water until the horizon looked bruised with soot. The Japanese had come expecting to obliterate the beachhead, and instead they were being annihilated. Evans swung his gun again as radar reported another Betty attempting to flee north. The bomber was climbing beyond 11,000 feet, hoping to break above the effective ceiling of the flak, but that faith was misplaced. The 90mm gun could strike targets at more than 30,000 feet. Evans elevated the barrel to its limit. He fired a shell that seemed to drift forever upward until it burst 200 meters ahead of the Japanese plane. The pilot reacted instinctively, banking sharply into the next timed detonation that struck the cockpit with brutal accuracy. The bomber tumbled out of control and crashed into the sea 9 miles north of Renova. 9 down. By 0930, the Japanese attack had completely collapsed. Of the 16 bombers that began the run, only 4 were still airborne, and those survivors were in full retreat, climbing desperately toward the northwest, fleeing at maximum power, while the Zero fighters had long since abandoned them to their fate. Renova had turned Suicide Point into something else entirely, but Evans was not finished. Radar tracked one of the retreating bombers at 12 miles, the very edge of accurate firing range. It flew at 14,000 feet, almost out of reach. Almost. Evans loaded and fired anyway. The shell arced upward, exploding 300 meters from the aircraft, too distant for a kill, but close enough to remind the enemy that Renova was no longer a place where Japanese planes could roam unchallenged. Somewhere behind him, Evans heard the call for ceasefire at 0932, 27 minutes after the first radar reading. Slowly the guns of Renova fell silent. The abrupt quiet was almost painful after the non-stop thunder that had pounded the island. Evans stepped back from the weapon chest, heaving ears, ringing body, trembling from exhaustion and adrenaline. His crew slumped against the sandbags, drenched in sweat, their faces grey with fatigue. They had executed the same motion for nearly half an hour load, ram set fire until their minds surrendered to instinct alone. Battery C's log showed 53 shells fired. Across Renova, the 12 90mm guns had hurled 88 rounds into the sky. The results were unprecedented, and Evans knew without being told that nothing about this day would be forgotten. The echoes of the battle still drifted across Renova as smoke thinned in the sky, and the smell of burning fuel rolled in heavy waves over the beach. Evans lowered himself onto one knee, feeling his legs shake uncontrollably, not from fear, but from the sheer physical strain of firing a heavy gun without pause for nearly half an hour. The ceasefire at 0932 had brought a silence so sudden it felt unnatural after the non-stop violence of the engagement. For a moment, all he could hear was the ringing in his ears and the faint hiss of cooling metal as the 90mm M1 released its heat into the air. His crew dropped back against the sandbags, breathing in deep, uneven bursts, their hands shaking as they wiped sweat from their faces. They had fired 53 rounds from Battery C's gun, 3 alone and across the battalion. The 12 guns had sent 88 shells into the air in less than 30 minutes. Colonel Scheer walked the gun line around 1000 hours. He moved slowly, counting wreckage reports and speaking to crews in short-clipped phrases. Every battery was claiming hits. Some claimed 2, some claimed 3. Battery C was reporting 4 confirmed kills. Battery E had 3. Batteria had 2. The numbers were coming together into something almost unbelievable. The radar operators confirmed it before long. 12 Japanese bombers had been destroyed. 4 had escaped. That meant the 9th Defense Battalion had achieved a kill ratio no American anti-aircraft unit in the Pacific had ever matched, not at Guadalcanal, not at Midway, not anywhere across the vast theater where Japanese air power had rained destruction. 12 kills with 88 shells meant nearly 14% accuracy where most units were grateful for 2%. But the numbers alone did not capture what the Marines had accomplished. The bombers had not simply been shot down. Their entire mission had been shattered before it even began. 16 Betty bombers had approached Renova carrying 8,000 pounds of bombs, each a total of 128,000 pounds of explosives, targeted at the supply, dumps the landing craft, the artillery positions, and the Marines manning the beach. Not one bomb touched the island. The Japanese had dropped their loads early in panic and fled. The 4 surviving bombers were tracked by radar as they fled northwest, limping along at reduced speed and altitude. At least 2 were losing fuel so quickly they would not make it back to Rabaul and would likely crash into the Solomon Sea. By 1100 hours, work teams were already recovering debris drifting in from the channel. Wing sections floated like broken rafts. Tail assemblies with the red rising sun still visible washed against the sand. Oil pooled in dark smears across 5 miles of coastline. Engines half melted from fire and seawater lay scattered along the surf. The Seabees returned to unloading supply ships. Marines crawled out of foxholes brushing mud from their uniforms and returned immediately to repairing the beachhead. The war did not pause, but something fundamental had changed. Suicide Point did not feel like Suicide Point anymore. Evans began cleaning the gun at 1300 hours. Even 3 hours after the battle, the barrel was still too hot to touch. Steam hissed faintly each time the sea breeze brushed over the metal. The rifling remained intact, no signs of warping. The M1 had held together through a punishment that should have destroyed it. All along the gun line, Marines inspected their weapons, checking mounts, adjusting fire control equipment, and restocking ammunition. The Japanese would be back. They always came back. But now Renova had shown that it could defend itself. At 1500 hours, a Marine combat photographer arrived from the core camera unit, asking for the crew responsible for the highest number of kills. Evans and his team lined up beside the 90mm gun for 6 photographs. Boone on the left, Evans in the middle, Gamborowski on the right. 3 young men looking far older than their ages after a day that had carved itself into their lives. Only one photo survived the war. It became National Archives Image 127GW. The caption read, "This is one of the anti-aircraft guns which wiped out a Japanese bomber fleet of 12 planes in a single day at Renova Island." But while that photograph captured the triumph on the beach, another story was unfolding 400 miles northwest, where the Japanese commanders at Rabaul were receiving the first fragmented reports from the few bombers that had escaped. The surviving crews radioed in with voices filled with exhaustion, shock, and disbelief. They spoke of American guns that fired with radar precision tracking bombers through cloud cover and guiding shells to burst within only a few meters of their aircraft. They spoke of flak so accurate that climbing, turning, diving, or scattering made no difference. The Japanese high command realized immediately what that meant. If Renova could generate fire this accurate, then every Japanese position across the Solomon chain was suddenly vulnerable. The mathematics that had defined Japanese air dominance since 1941 were beginning to shift beneath their feet. For the Marines on Renova, the significance of this shift would not become fully clear until the days ahead. For now, they focused only on repairs, rest, and replenishment. But by the time the sun began to set over the battered island, everyone understood that the events of that morning had rewritten more than just a battlefield. They had changed the balance of power in the air over the Pacific. Yet even as Evans finished wiping down the breach, and the crew stepped back to rest in the fading light, he felt the uneasy certainty that the Japanese would not let this humiliation go unanswered. They would come again, and when they did, the 9th Defense Battalion would be waiting. At Rabaul, the Japanese commanders gathered around radios and intelligence reports, trying to understand how an island they had bombed into near silence only 2 days earlier had suddenly become a fortress guided by radar-directed fire that struck with deadly accuracy. The 4 surviving bombers sent fragmented transmissions describing American shells that burst almost on top of them, as if guided by invisible hands. They reported that the Americans now possessed radar capable of tracking formations through cloud and rain, guiding their heavy guns with frightening precision. These reports alarmed the officers at Rabaul because if Renova had such capabilities, then every Japanese base across the Central Solomons was suddenly at risk. The calculation that had defined Japanese air superiority for nearly 2 years had shifted. Their daylight raids that once terrorized American beachheads were now becoming suicide missions, but decisions at high command took time. While Japanese strategists debated new tactics, Evan Evans and the 9th Defense Battalion faced a different challenge altogether. On the afternoon of July 4th at 1600 hours, the first message from Admiral Halsey's headquarters reached Renova. It contained 3 words only confirm kill count. Colonel Scheer responded immediately listing 12 bombers destroyed, 4 fleeing, 88 rounds fired, 0 American casualties during the engagement, 0 bombs striking the island. The reply came 30 minutes later, demanding a full after-action report. Admiral Halsey wanted every detail: how the battalion had integrated radar and fire control so effectively, how the gun crews coordinated timing calculations, how the radar operators compensated for mechanical lag in the Sperry M4 directors, and how one Marine gun line had achieved a 90% destruction rate against a major Japanese bomber formation. Scheer spent the night writing reports. Radar technicians wrote theirs. Gun directors recorded their firing sequences, fuse settings, and adjustments. Every crewman whose hands had touched a shell logged his part in the engagement. These documents moved rapidly up the chain of command from Renova to 14th Corps, then to South Pacific Area Command, then across thousands of miles to Pearl Harbor, where officers read with astonishment how a small defense battalion had achieved what many had believed impossible. While these reports traveled north, the Japanese made their next move. At Rabaul, commanders decided to strike Renova again, but cautiously. On July 5th, they sent 6 bombers under cover of darkness. These aircraft flew at 20,000 feet, dropping bombs blindly from above the clouds. None hit the island. Renova's guns fired 37 rounds and claimed 2 kills. The surviving planes retreated before even reaching their bomb release points. The Japanese tried again on July 6th, sending 4 bombers at night. These 2 dropped bombs from extreme altitude and missed everything of value. One failed to return. By July 10th, the pattern was clear. The Japanese no longer dared to fly daylight raids over Renova because daylight meant death. The radar-guided anti-aircraft fire was too strong, too accurate, too coordinated. Instead, they resorted to high-altitude night attacks that wasted fuel, achieved nothing, and cost more aircraft. The 9th Defense Battalion's success had implications far beyond the island. With Renova, secured the 155mm long tom artillery pieces that the battalion guarded could fire continuously into Japanese positions on New Georgia. Day and night, the heavy guns pounded enemy fortifications, softening the defenses that had once been nearly impossible to break. The American advance toward Munda Airfield gained momentum. Munda fell on August 5th. The Japanese lost their main air base in the Central Solomons. In 72 hours, Marines and Army engineers turned Munda into a functional American airfield. By August 14th, American fighters were launching from its runways, patrolling the skies once dominated by Japanese aircraft. The campaign that had begun with the Renova landings on June 30th reached its decisive turning point in just 5 weeks. By October, the 9th Defense Battalion transferred to New Georgia to defend the newly captured airfield. They set up their 90mm guns around Munda, waiting for expected counterattacks, but the attacks never came. The Japanese had withdrawn north toward Bougainville, abandoning the Central Solomons. The momentum of the war had shifted irreversibly. Evans and his crew spent 6 months on New Georgia, firing at occasional reconnaissance planes and scoring 3 more kills. But none of these engagements compared to the morning of July 4th, 1943, when everything had aligned perfectly and 12 bombers had fallen from the sky in 27 minutes. Marine Corps historians would later call the battle one of the most successful anti-aircraft engagements of the entire Pacific War. The radar operators had performed flawlessly. The gun crews had executed with unbroken precision. The weapons had exceeded their mechanical limits. The Japanese had been stopped cold. Yet behind the official praise and celebrated statistics lay a weight that did not appear in the reports or photographs. Because shooting down 12 bombers meant more than a tactical triumph. It meant more than stopping an attack. It meant more than saving the island. It meant more than protecting supply ships and artillery. It also meant killing more than 100 Japanese airmen and watching in helpless silence as some of the surviving crew parachuted into the ocean where no rescue boats could go. It meant hearing the distant cries of men struggling in the waves and knowing that survival sometimes demanded a hardness that stayed with a Marine long after the war ended. These truths were never entered into any after-action report. They were carried in silence. While the world saw 12 enemy planes falling in victory, a handful of Marines saw something else that never quite left them even decades later, when the official documents had yellowed and the photographs had faded. The 9th Defense Battalion learned that day that heroism had a cost not always paid on the battlefield itself, but in the years and memories that followed. The cost of that July 4th victory did not appear in the kill counts or the after-action summaries, and it did not show in the photographs of proud Marine gun crews standing beside their 90mm weapons. It lived inside the men who had fought the battle and stayed with them long after the Pacific War ended. Because bringing down 12 bombers meant more than destroying enemy aircraft. It meant ending the lives of more than 100 Japanese airmen, many of whom never had a chance to escape their burning planes, and a few who survived the explosions only to fall into the ocean with no hope of rescue. Evans saw some of them drifting in the waves as American ships passed without stopping, because war made mercy impossible in those moments. He learned that surviving sometimes meant carrying memories no one wanted to talk about later. But the 9th Defense Battalion continued its mission. After Renova and after the fall of Munda, they remained in the Central Solomons until March 1944, protecting the airfields that now supported American fighters and bombers. Munda grew quiet as the Japanese retreated northward toward Bougainville, where they hoped to mount a final defense. The battalion rarely fired their heavy guns except at occasional reconnaissance aircraft that ventured too close. They shot down 3 more planes during those months, but the engagements were nothing compared to the intensity of July 4th. That day still stood apart in their minds as the moment everything had changed. Evans was promoted to corporal in October 1943. Boone received his promotion in December. Gamborowski remained a private first class until January 1944. All 3 earned citations for their actions on Renova, though no one received medals because members of Marine Defense Battalions seldom did. Shooting down enemy aircraft was considered routine duty, even though routine work had saved the island and shifted the campaign. In April 1944, the 9th Defense Battalion relocated to the Russell Islands for rest and retraining. 6 months of continuous operations had worn down both men and equipment. The 90mm guns required new barrels. The M4 directors needed recalibration. The Marines needed time away from the sandbagged positions where they had stood for endless watches, staring up at hostile skies. They received 6 weeks of rest before new orders came. The battalion was shipping out to Guam. The landing on Guam began July 21, 1944. The 9th Defense Battalion went ashore at Agat on the first day, establishing defensive perimeters around the beachhead and positioning their anti-aircraft guns where they could shield the landing zones from air attack. Guam had been in Japanese hands since December 1941, and the defenders had turned the island into a network of caves and tunnels. 22,000 Japanese soldiers were dug into the cliffs and jungle waiting to repel the invasion. The battle raged for 3 weeks. The battalion fired their 90mm guns not only at Japanese aircraft, but also in direct fire against fortified ground positions. High explosive shells shattered bunkers and cave entrances. The Marines pushed inland through heat mud and thick vegetation. Japanese planes attempted several small raids, but the battalion shot down 4 more aircraft. Still, the deadliest enemy on Guam was not the Japanese. It was dengue fever. The disease swept through Marine ranks in August, weakening hundreds of men, including Evans, who fell ill with high fever, intense joint pain, and exhaustion that left him barely able to stand. He spent 2 weeks in a field hospital and lost 20 pounds. When he returned to his unit, the major battles for Guam were over. The Japanese were pushed into the northern cliffs, and many chose suicide rather than surrender. The 9th Defense Battalion stayed on Guam for the remainder of the war, guarding Apra Harbor and the newly built airfields that would soon host B-29 superfortresses. By October 1944, the giant bombers were launching from Guam to strike targets deep in Japan. The battalion's job was to protect them from night attacks. Japanese aircraft attempted several small night raids, usually 4 or 5 planes at a time. The battalion brought down 6 more enemy aircraft between September 1944 and March 1945, raising their total wartime tally to 46 confirmed kills. But even with all those victories, none equaled July 4th, 1943, when 12 enemy bombers had fallen in less than half an hour. Evans was still on Guam when the war finally ended in August 1945. He was 24 years old, a sergeant with 3 years in the Marine Corps, 2 Pacific campaigns behind him, and the knowledge that his battalion had destroyed 46 Japanese aircraft, 12 of them in a single morning when the fate of Renova had hung in the balance. The 9th Defense Battalion returned to the United States in February 1946, sailing into San Diego Harbor on the 23rd. The battalion was deactivated a week later at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. Evans went home to Richmond, Indiana, a different man from the 21-year-old private who had left 3 years earlier. He re-enlisted in 1948, served through the Korean War, rose to Staff Sergeant, and left the Marine Corps in 1953, after 11 years of service. He married, raised children, and worked as a machinist, but he never spoke freely about that day at Renova. The memories stayed with him, the sound of the guns, the sight of spinning aircraft falling like burning stars. The knowledge that 88 shells had changed the course of a battle and the path of a campaign. Evans rarely discussed it, even with those closest to him, because the men who lived it understood, and those who had not lived it never truly could. Yet he carried the weight quietly for decades, knowing that what happened on that morning would remain with him long after the war had faded from public memory. Evans carried the weight of Renova quietly for decades, speaking of it only when asked in direct conversations, and even then offering only the basic facts, as if hiding the deeper memories behind careful restraint. He lived his life in Richmond, Indiana, working steady hours, raising his children, maintaining the routines of a peaceful world that seemed impossibly distant from the morning when 12 Japanese bombers fell from the sky under the fire of the 9th Defense Battalion. He believed the story had faded into the archives of the Marine Corps, lost among thousands of reports written during the long Pacific War. Then in 1993, 50 years after the battle, a letter he wrote changed everything. Evans had reached the age of 72 when he mailed a simple request to the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. He asked if they had any photographs of a 90mm anti-aircraft gun. Any photo at all, he wrote. He just wanted something he could show his grandchildren to help them understand the weapon he had served on. The archivist who received the letter, a man named Alan Walker, spent part of his day searching through the extensive collection of Marine Corps photographs. He located numerous images of the M1 gun, but something in Evans' brief note caught his attention. Evans had mentioned Renova. He had mentioned July 4th, 1943. he had mentioned a record of shooting down Japanese bombers. Walker returned to the archives with that in mind and began searching under Series 127GW, the combat photography taken in the New Georgia campaign. The photograph appeared on the 4th page. 3 young Marines stood beside a 90mm gun, positioned in sandbags beneath the open sky. Their faces were serious, determined, still carrying the weight of the battle they had fought. The caption identified them. Private First Class Evan Evans, age 22, from Richmond, Indiana. Private Roy E. Boone from Indianapolis, Indiana. Private First Class John S. Gamborowski, age 20, from Saginaw, Michigan. Beneath the names the caption read, "This is one of the anti-aircraft guns which wiped out a Japanese bomber fleet of 12 planes in a single day at Renova Island." Walker placed the photograph in an envelope and mailed it to Evans. 2 weeks later, Evans wrote back. His handwriting carried the tremble of age, but the message was clear. He had never known the photograph existed. He had never imagined anyone would remember the battle except the men who had survived it. Seeing himself at 22 years old, standing beside the gun that had made history, brought back 50 years of memories, some sharp, some painful, some long buried. He thanked Walker and explained that the image meant more to him than the archivist could ever understand. He said he had carried Renova with him every day for half a century, and perhaps now he could let a little of it go. Evans died in 2004 at age 83. Boone had passed in 1998. Gamborowski followed in 2006. The gun crew that had stood together on July 4, 1943, had left the world in the same silence with which they had carried their memories, but the story did not vanish. The official records survived, the photograph survived. The memory of the 9th Defense Battalion's achievement at Renova lived on inside the Marine Corps and within historical accounts of the Pacific War. Their success became part of a larger understanding of how American forces learned to counter Japanese air power, not simply through bravery, but through technology discipline and the precision that radar-guided fire made possible. After the Renova engagement, the techniques developed by the 9th Defense Battalion spread throughout the Pacific. Radar operators and gun directors across frontline islands trained to integrate signals with the Sperry mechanical computers, adjusting for lag, calibrating fuses, calculating trajectories with finer accuracy. As these methods took hold, American kill ratios climbed steadily. Japanese bombers flying daylight raids found themselves facing increasingly lethal flak. By 1944, daylight bombing raids had become rare. By 1945, they had nearly disappeared. The Japanese could not train new air crews fast enough to replace the ones lost. They could not replace the aircraft destroyed in the skies over Renova, Munda, Bougainville, and the countless islands touched by the Pacific War. The mathematics that Evans and his crew had demonstrated on that single morning spread across an entire theater of conflict, shifting the balance one shell at a time. Today, Renova is quiet. The guns are long gone. The sandbags have rotted. The wooden platforms have collapsed into earth. The jungle has reclaimed most of the positions where the 9th Defense Battalion fought and sweated and waited beneath the tropical sun. If a visitor walks the northern shoreline, they may find rusted fragments of metal or the faint outlines of bunkers hidden under vines. The sea washes gently over the stretch of water where burning bombers once fell like broken stars. Each July 4th, a small handful of people remember what happened there. They remember the morning the planes came in their tight V formation expecting an easy kill. They remember how 12 of them fell in 27 minutes under the fire of Marines who refused to yield. They remember Evan Evans and Roy Boone and John Gamborowski, 3 young Americans who manned a weapon heavier than a pickup truck and turned Suicide Point into a place where the attackers paid the price instead of the defenders. And though the island may be quiet, and the guns may be gone, and the war may be a fading memory in books and films, there remains a truth that echoes through time. Renova mattered. The men who stood there mattered. Their courage and precision changed more than a single battle. They altered the course of a campaign and helped shift the Pacific War toward its final outcome. Evans never sought recognition. He never asked for medals or ceremonies. He asked only for a picture of a gun to show his grandchildren so they might know what he had done. And in that simple request, the legacy of the 9th Defense Battalion was kept alive. For the men who fought there, and for the thousands whose lives were shaped by their victory on that distant morning, their story endures not in loud celebrations, but in quiet remembrance passed forward one generation at a time. If you want more forgotten war stories told with truth, grit, and no filters, subscribe now. Your support keeps these missions alive.